Today I'm joined by Will Greenberg. Will is strength and conditioning coach for the Buffalo Bills. Previously worked as director of S&C at the Southern Utah University, assistant S&C at the United States Military Academy, director of S&C at the Appalachian University, and assistant S&C at the University of Florida. Welcome, Will.
Thanks, Christian. Thanks for having me.
Well, how's life at this moment in the COVID-19 crisis and the NFL? How do you cope?
Yeah, it's difficult for everyone. We're just doing the best that we can, staying safe, staying healthy, trying to support our athletes the best that we can.
Let's jump right into it. How did you get into strength and conditioning?
As a kid, I was always the smallest. I was a little bit of a late bloomer, and I was always gravitated towards sports. I played baseball, basketball, I ran track. I was just a generally active kid. And I remember the first time walking into a weight room when I was 13 years old, and it looked like a playground, and it looked like something that I wanted to do. And if I knew now what I knew, if I knew then what I knew now about what was going on in that facility, it was a totally Nautilus facility of John Philbin, who had been a formerly Arthur Jones disciple. I wish I had, like I said, I wish I had known then what I know now about what I could have accomplished there. But either way, it was something that was encouraging for me for sport. I loved every aspect of it. I loved the challenge of it. I loved the physical and mental challenge of it. So after college, where I played baseball and was part of a strength conditioning program at the University of Maryland, I realized that it could be a job for me after school. So I started as an intern with my former baseball program and strength coach there, just to test the field out a little bit. And once I dipped my toes in, I just wanted to jump right in.
And that was primarily baseball?
Yeah. So I started, like I said, I played baseball in college. I played some basketball. And after I was done, I started an internship in a graduate assistant position at the University of Florida with Preston Green. And that was all with basketball. It just happened to be with basketball. It had nothing to do with whether I preferred it. I just knew of the reputation of Preston Green and sent him emails for 8 months asking if he needed an assistant, asking if he needed a graduate assistant. And finally, when the time came, he called me up, said, "Hey, I'm tired of you bothering me. Why don't you come down and help me out?" So that's how I started back in the collegiate setting, was in basketball, actually, which is a relatively unique setting. Most strength conditioning coaches in college in the U.S. start in football and then branch off from there. So I had the unique opportunity to learn from someone who I greatly respected in a little bit of a different context, which allows me to see things sometimes in a different light.
How many emails did you send him?
Oh, it must have been once a week for 8 months. I knew that I needed to get my name in there. It was a competitive environment. Luckily, I had someone who knew him on my side, so I just wanted to stay in contact. And that's actually some advice that I give to younger strength coaches trying to break into business: is just pester someone. Be respectful, but pester someone. Go see if you can shadow them. He came to town, he was at Clemson at the time. When they came to Maryland, where I was living, I went to go see him and introduce myself and watch them play the University of Maryland. So again, I was respectful as possible, but I was trying to put my name in his ear and show some value to him, so that when the time came, it would be a no-brainer for him.
Yeah, I had spoken to Matt Little, Andy Murray's S&C coach, and he said something very similar. When he started out, he wanted to go to Australia to learn the trade of strength and conditioning, and he sent mails after mails after mails. Always respectful, but after some time, people tend to reply.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
What was your darkest moment as an S&C coach?
It's a good question. Something I value in S&C is connection with the athlete. And I think all my darkest moments end up being my athlete's darkest moments, right? Maybe where I felt like I failed them in some way, or they failed, or I could have done something to help them. So it's not necessarily a personal moment in my life that was the darkest moment, but I can recall multiple times where I felt like I could have done more for an athlete, that they failed or they didn't reach their potential. And it allows me to reflect on how I could have done more for that athlete, because part of this job is connecting and helping others, which really is what leads to fulfillment within the job, right? Is connecting and helping people succeed. So I'd say those are my darkest moments, whether they be small or big. It's always something that I reflect upon.
You have a specific example?
When I was at Southern Utah, it was my first chance to really lead a football team. And I remember, I thought I had it figured out. I thought I had it figured out. I thought we were going to train hard, get strong, put a bunch of muscle mass on guys, establish a culture, everything that a strength coach is supposed to do. And I thought I was doing really well. And we got to the season and we had more injuries than I would have ever expected. Non-contact ACLs, we had hamstrings, we had contact injuries as well, things that were probably unavoidable. But every time an athlete got injured, I would have this pit in my stomach, this feeling in my stomach like I didn't do enough for that athlete. And in my initial reaction, I wanted to apologize to that athlete. Maybe it wasn't avoidable, maybe it was, but I always took that with me, and I know that it's never going to be perfect, and I'm never going to have the singular answer to how to avoid those injuries. But I just recall the first thing that came to my mind was those injuries when I was a director there, because I felt like I was directly responsible.
Yeah, I can relate to that. I also have some memories from the past where I think like maybe I could have done more, or sometimes I have two cases where I think I couldn't help the person as much as I should have, for various reasons, also injuries and stuff. But it's a feeling you carry with you where you think
always,
like not sure whether I did everything I could. What was your best moment?
And there are probably a few, but again, it goes back to connecting with those athletes. There's one in particular, and it's a pretty bittersweet moment for me. When I was at the United States Military Academy, Army football, I came in with a new staff, and they hadn't beat Navy, which is a huge game, Army versus Navy. It's America's game, they call it. They hadn't beat Navy in 12 years when we got there. And you play 12 games in a season in at Army. If you go 1-11, you beat Navy, it's a good year. That's how important that game is. And so myself and the staff that I was on, the strength staff, we were part of a culture turnaround. And I was there for 2.5 years. I left right before the third season began. I went to Southern Utah. And in the 2 years that I was there prior, we hadn't beat Navy. And when I left, I came back for the Army-Navy game, which was in December. And, I wasn't on the sideline. I was up in the nosebleeds. And it was the first time they had beat Navy in 14 years. And I remember being up in the nosebleeds, way up above, watching everyone that I had just spent the last 2.5 years making some of the strongest connections of my life with, celebrate. And of course, I'm up in the nosebleeds celebrating, screaming, crying. And again, that was one of the best moments in my life to watch those people, but it was also bittersweet because I wasn't down there with them. So, it's about the connections with the players and the athletes and the coaches and everyone that's involved in a team sport like this. And whenever there's a success, that's always such a high moment. But looking back, it's the experience of the struggle and the strain that you go through with all those people as you get there.
Yeah. If you could travel back in time, 10, 15, 20 years, what advice would you give your younger self?
You know what? I don't know if I'd want to give myself any advice. I think I'd want myself to figure out what I have figured out, or take the path that by chance. A lot of where I've gotten today was just by betting on myself, going to internship to GA to another internship, not getting paid very much for a while, and just betting on myself that if I educated myself, if I met these people, if I ran into someone by chance and stayed in contact with them, I would grow my network, I would grow my knowledge, I would grow my wisdom, and eventually I'd get somewhere where I could be proud of the work that I put in. So, I wouldn't necessarily give myself any advice. I think that my attitude back then was what I wanted it to be. I wanted to grind. I wanted to get somewhere. I had a goal in mind. I had a purpose to work for. So, I think he's good. I think he can handle himself.
So the advice would be keep going.
Keep going.
Cool. What advice would you give young aspiring S&C coaches? You already mentioned pester people respectfully.
Yeah.
Can you expand on that or further?
Yeah, there's probably a couple things. Number one, invest in yourself, and that might be part of it. Of sending an email to someone that you respect and just reach out to them. Right, not asking for all the advice in the world, but say, I respect your work. I'd love to chat to you at some point, maybe come talk shop. But people's time is valuable, so you have to be very respectful of that. But invest in courses, invest in books, invest your time into reading and learning and trying to understand things better and challenging yourself. Always spend time with people who have a different point of view than you. It's easy to be in an echo chamber with other strength coaches or other professionals that just mimic the same thing you do, echo the same thing that you do, confirm each other. But it's really hard to go and spend time with people who see it in a different light. People who will challenge you, people who are unrelenting in that way. I think that's a really important thing for a young person to do is, and then, outside of that, understand that there's not a singular answer to things. That's why it's important to go find different views. It's really easy to think that if I need to solve this problem, I'm going to use a simple answer. There's a best practice to it, but there are a lot of different ways to skin a cat. There's a lot of different good practices, and some answers that we may not even know until we get into that situation. So, always keep an open mind, challenge yourself, surround yourself with people that are going to challenge you.
How would you go about finding these people that challenge you?
Probably just through an iterative process of going through and talking to people. I know that in my experience, I would call people that I knew were smart, that I thought were smarter than me. And I would develop a friendship and a relationship, and I would bounce my ideas off them and ask for critical feedback. And then it's spending time with someone. And if you feel like you're two peas in the pod, it's great. It's always fun to spend time with that person, but go find other people, and that might be through browsing through social media and seeing who has a different perspective than you. That might be asking someone who may have a similar opinion of, let's take opposite sides of the coin here and let's have an argument about it. Let's see if we can challenge our really deeply held beliefs and still come out believing the same thing, or if we've changed our mind in some way. I think that's actually a very valuable tool, is if you're debating with someone, flipping the roles and saying, okay, now I get to debate your side and you debate my side to me, and we'll try to argue that way. And it just opens up a new perspective for yourself.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. You have worked in the university setting and professional sports setting. What would you say are commonalities and what are differences?
Well, sport is always sport, wherever you go. I'd say that's the universal truth, or the same part of it. But the relationships definitely have to be different. In the college setting, you're more of an authority. A college player comes in, you tell them what to do, and they're going to obey the rules. And if not, they're disciplined. It's almost like a military type approach. But the relationship you form with them is, coach and athlete almost I don't want to go as far as say as father-son, but it's something where there's a authority figure respect within that setting. In the professional setting, it's different because you're more of a guide. You're all employed by the same person. Most likely the players are going to be being paid more than the coaches, in some cases. So you're being more of a guide. You're trying to develop trust in a very short period of time, because what you're trying to do there is not necessarily develop them. You may only have a week, a month, a year, maybe a few years with a player. So it's more about optimizing what they already have and trying to polish the weaknesses and emphasize strengths. So, it's less of a disciplinarian, more of a colleague, guide. Let me shape your path so that it's easiest for you to succeed.
Yeah. And working in the NFL, to the best of my knowledge, athletes have short careers compared to other American sports. There's also high pressure of performing. How does that play out in the delivery of S&C? So just talk us through generally how you approach and your colleagues approach the training.
Yeah, so I believe there's a statistic that the average lifespan in the NFL is 3.3 years. Right? Some people joke it stands for not for long, and that goes along with players, coaches, people. It's a very high pressure league, right? So in terms of planning for the athletes, the first thing that you have to do is develop a sense of trust with them, right? Because they know that their career may be short or their time may be short. So they only want to do what's going to lengthen their career, right? Of course, everyone wants to win. Everyone wants to be a part of a winning team. But their business also is lengthening their career within that team. So with trust comes competence and character, right? So the first thing you have to show is that you're authentic to people. You're there for the right reasons and you're there for them. And you have to show that you're competent in what you're saying and what you do. So the communication piece to me really sums that up, that I can communicate effectively to a player, whether they just got here or they've been here for years, that this is what is required of them to be successful. And I'm coming from an authentic place of high character, and my competence and my understanding of what I'm talking about. And players will challenge you and test you and ask you questions that they may already know the answer to, but they want to probe and see what you have to say. So your ability to answer those and communicate as well is a huge part of gaining their trust. And then from there, like I said, it's about polishing some of the weaknesses and emphasizing strengths. And throughout the time of the year, you might spend more time on one than the other. But again, you don't know how long you're going to have an athlete. So you want to make sure that there's no, yearly plan for a player. It's what can we optimize at this moment and then work as it emerges.
And then how does it work? You have different positions in American football as well. Is the S&C coach also, do you have different S&C coaches for different positions? How does it work? Or just talk us through it.
No, that's a good question. I think every team probably does it a little bit differently. Yeah. Some people break it up into position groups. Some people mailbox things into big, medium, and skill, which are going to be all your big guys and your inside the box linemen. Some people, skill guys are outside the box, players that are fast and need to change direction. Combo guys or mid skill are going to be kind of a combination of both. They have to go inside the box, which would be where a lot of the wrestling happens in the hitting, and then outside the box they have to go out in coverage where they have to run and sprint and change direction and whether on offense or defense. So there's a few different ways to mailbox those. You could say you could do it by priorities of training as well. So it just depends on what the emphasis of the program is. because I'm sure that all 32 teams do it somewhat differently. And then in college, there are different ways to do it as well, because you may have more players. You may have players that, since you have more players, there may be a lot more that don't play, that might be on a practice squad in the NFL, or redshirt in college, that they have a year where they're not going to play at all. So there's a bunch of different little subcategories of players that need development or optimization, whatever place that they may be.
What's your coaching philosophy?
Oh, that's a good question. Philosophy is kind of a funny word to me, just because it's in theory, right? Philosophy would mean in theory. So I always like to look at it in practice. But really, there's a few things that come to mind. You have to understand your principles deeply, right? What are your first principles? You have to recognize the context that you're in applying your principles. You have to make the process iterative, or you have to try little different little things as you go, right? And then you have to challenge your deeply held beliefs, right? So it's kind of like a cycle. I understand my deeply held beliefs. I understand my first principles. I recognize the context that I'm in, so that as I apply my principles, I can see the small little changes that I need to make. And then after that's done, I can look back retrospectively and say, okay, were those principles correct? Can I challenge myself on that? Do I need to expand my thought process in how to be successful? So, for my example of when I was at Southern Utah and I had more injuries than I expected, I had very deeply held beliefs, and those were my principles. I may not have recognized the context or understood enough in applying those. And as I reflected back after the year, I was able to challenge myself and say, okay, what did I not see? What principle or belief do I need to strip down a little bit further and try to understand better? So that's how I see my philosophy and how I put it into action.
Interesting. What are your core values?
I've probably spoke about them already. Is connection is one, and then growth. I think those are two things that I value and bring fulfillment to myself, bring fulfillment to my life. Is, I can connect both in strength and conditioning and outside of strength and conditioning with people. And that helps me feel more fulfilled in my life, right? I feel like I have a purpose when I have other people around me. And growth to me is another one that's the same thing. I can grow myself. I can help grow others, which helps me connect. I can grow both inside and outside of strength conditioning. But those are two values that I've seen across the span of my life, both in and outside of my job, that I hold pretty dear.
So in a team of coaches and support staff, everyone is wearing his own hat, and sometimes there's disagreement. Mm-hmm. How do you deal with that kind of disagreement?
There's always going to be disagreement, but, a mentor of mine told me once that conflict arises from misaligned expectations. So the best way to deal with any type of disagreement is to avoid it in the first place. Right? So communication with everyone on staff or anyone who has to wear a different hat, whether it be a different coach or a trainer or an athlete, if you can proactively communicate everything that's being done and align expectations, most of the time conflict can be avoided in that way.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Dealing with individuals. Mm-hmm. Very often we deal with individuals that have their own ideas of how things have to be done or should be done. If these ideas don't align with your ideas, how do you influence change?
Yeah, change management is a great topic of discussion because it's really difficult. Again, I think the first thing goes back to communication, is aligning expectations. And even that may be difficult because expectations may come from a different place, right? I'm expecting A and someone else is expecting Z. The next thing would be being a proactive listener to what they actually expect or what they want. right? Because a lot of times we may on the surface explain, here's my expectation, but if you dig a little bit deeper with that person, that expectation may mirror yours a little bit more than you thought, right? So listen to what they have to say, try to understand better where they're coming from, because their context may be completely different than your context in the way that you're seeing it. So the more perspective you can get, the more reality you can actually see between you and that other person. So communication, listening, and then the last part would be trying to draw each other closer to each other's points, right? So, and that happens with really good discussion and effective communication of, here's what I'm hearing that you're saying, and here's why, and here's how what I'm saying mirrors that or comes close. Can we find some type of agreement within there? It's not you're right against I'm wrong or the other way around. It's how do we find the best solution given what we're seeing here as a collective whole.
It's like this one of the 7 habits of highly effective people. It's like seek to understand before being understood.
Yep, which is it's difficult. It's difficult because you immediately want to go to, well, I think my opinion's right, and we start to identify that what I'm thinking is the right way to do it because that's what I see. But again, we're all biased in some way, so you have to go outside of that to try to find what other people are seeing and what other people are saying, and have the humility to say, this is what I believe, but my beliefs aren't attached to who I am, right? It's a lot easier to let your guard down when you say that.
Yeah. How does a typical training day as an S&C coach in the NFL look like?
I guess it depends on the time of year. I mean, right now it's a lot different than it usually would be, but I'd say in some way there's always going to be some type of caffeine. There's always going to be some type of protein, and there's always going to be some type of training, right? And then I'll add on to that, there's always going to be some type of stimulation of the mind. So, it's just stimulation of the mind, the body, and the spirit or the soul in some way. Regardless of the day, it's always going to be something along those lines.
How do you design a training program step by step?
It goes back to understanding your principles. You first have to identify the person's needs, right? Identify the needs, and then going back to communicating, you have to collaborate with everyone who's involved who has a touch point with that athlete, right? There's the physical training aspect of it. There's the mental training. There's the rehabilitation and recovery side of it. There's the skills, the technical and tactical components. So really there's the physical, mental, technical, and tactical components of training. And if I were just to look at the physical component and say, I'm just doing my job, I'm going to stay in my lane, that's a difficult way to say that I have been successful at my job or I've made an impact on the player in some way, because that's the ultimate goal, right? Is to impact the player so that they're more able to succeed in their sport. So collaborating with everyone who has a touch point on that: coach, trainer, dietitian, mental skills coach, physical therapist, strength coach, whoever has that touch point, that's part of the planning process. So you're identifying the needs and addressing the needs from every aspect of that. And then communication also, I left out one piece of that, is communicating with the athlete. The athlete, what are they feeling? What do they feel like they need to work on? And trying to understand the process from their point of view, because no one knows their body more than they do. And sometimes that's really valuable information. So once you gather that information and you identify the needs, you use underlying principles of the physiology of the body to make a specific adaptation. And then within that is the communication of, here's the process we're going to go through to the athlete, to the coach, everyone who needs to know, here's how we're going to do it. Here are the markers that we're looking for. And checking in periodically to say, hey, we've hit our markers or we haven't, here's why, or here's how we're going to proceed from here. It's just a constant process trying to find the best path as it emerges under your feet to drive the athlete towards the goal that they're looking for.
Cool. You have discussed dealing with complex problems in the S&C industry. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I gave a talk, Coaches versus COVID, in early April about um, finding solutions to complex problems. And I mentioned it earlier in our talk here that there are really not that many simple answers to problems within our field. And usually that comes along with programming, it comes along with dealing with injuries, it comes along with creating a culture, right? Three things that we're kind of evaluated on as strength coaches. They don't have simple answers. There's no research article or book or even piece of advice from someone that's going to span every experience that we can have, right? You're always going to run into problems that are different, or have a little bit different context, or that you haven't seen before, and you have to try a new solution. But again, the reason that I think it's important is because we're evaluated on improving performance, of mitigating the risk of injury, of being the keeper of the culture, or providing the landscape where a culture can grow. But all these things are not simple. There's no best practice to them, right? And best practice would mean that there's one practice. There's one best way to do that, right? If a car is low on gas, best practice is to put gas in the car, right? But once the car gets out on the highway, I may know the route to get home, right? But there's a million different drivers. This guy's cutting me off. That guy flipped me the bird. I'm trying to avoid this accident that happened. I might have missed my exit. So I may know the route to get there, but there are so many different things that I wouldn't know happen until I got on that path. And that's a lot how performance happens. That's a lot how injury happens. That's a lot how cultures emerge. Is you have to make the best decisions as they come to you, right? It's emergent practice, not necessarily best practice. Now, we can use our understanding of research and previous experience that has been successful for us as looking at what we could call good practice. Like sometimes complicated problems show good practice where there are multiple different answers. But I would never be able to map out a year worth of training for someone and say, I'm going to go from point A to point B within 12 months. There's just too much complexity within that to say that I'm going to stay on that linear path the entire time. So understanding that is a really big component to how I approach training, to how I approach relationships with people, both inside strength conditioning and outside, is understanding that I may not have the answers, but if I can recognize the perspective and the context that it's in, I may be able to address that problem with a better solution because I was more open to it, not rigid in saying, I'm going to try to fit this square peg through a round hole.
Yeah. And then two questions come to my mind. Complexity can often lead to confusion, right? Because the more complex it gets, and you mentioned if you don't have an answer to a question, what do you do? So complexity leads to confusion. How do you manage that? And the second question is, if there is a question you cannot answer, what's your process of finding an answer or finding a possible solution?
Yeah, and this is where it gets sticky, right? This is why people step away from this and look for best practice. They look for good practice. They look for answers because it's sticky and it's uncomfortable to say, I'm going to step into complexity. I'm going to step into something that is really confusing and really challenge myself, right? And maybe the challenge is what I really enjoy about this, but I see it a little bit on the flip side. It's not that complexity gets confusing, is that I use understanding complexity for confusing problems, right? So let me use Southern Utah for an example again, and I keep going back to that with the injuries, right? I thought I had done all my research to understand how to prevent injuries. So that might have been good practice or best practice or something that's predictable and repeatable. Well, all of a sudden I get in the situation and there are multiple injuries that happen. And I said, well, I had done all my research. I had understood the answer. It should have been predictable and repeatable, but injuries are not that way. They're not predictable and repeatable. Now we can put a good guess forward and try to account for all the different variables, but there's no injury prediction model yet that will prevent all injuries. In fact, we're probably seeing a rise in injuries in many different sports. But what you can do is search and account for every variable that may matter, right? Track that, understand that, record that. Okay, so if I were to go back and give myself some advice back then, again, I wouldn't have, so because I needed to figure this out myself, was look at previous injury history, track load, understand what age they were, right? Because above 26, all of a sudden injuries start to occur more frequently. What was their mental capacity? What was like a wellness questionnaire, mental, psychological, physical readiness? All of those things are going to start to show a bigger picture of potentially what can occur. And from there, I can communicate that information to the parties that need to know that. Hey, coach, this guy's training load has been high the last 3 days, and I know that he has had a previous history of hamstring injuries. We may need to pull back his high-speed running within today's practice just in case that this happens. Now, maybe it's an overreaction, maybe it's not, but I record that and say, here's why it was the best decision at the time. Because I can't know what's going to happen, right? I can't know whether or not that person's going to get injured, whether or not we saved him from an injury, because that's the other part of it is I'm never going to be able to go to a coach and say, I prevented 93 injuries this year. I may have had 17, but I prevented 93. It doesn't work that way. But when it comes time to evaluate how you did over the year, you have a book of why these decisions you made were the best decisions at the time. Right, here are the red flags that we saw. Here's how we approached that, and here's why we possibly helped that situation. Right now, you pull back on the player's training to a more appropriate load, and he still injures himself. Well, you made the attempt, right? The attempt was there. Maybe it was just not soon enough. Maybe it was just inevitable that happened. Again, you'll never know those things, but it gives you a better talking point to show your value as a practitioner, rather than saying, well, we got him strong. I don't know why he got hurt. Maybe he just wasn't strong enough. You have an understanding for yourself and for your evaluation as a practitioner.
Yeah.
And then what was the second question that you asked? I went off on a tangent, forgot.
One was complexity can lead to confusion.
Yep.
And the second question, I think you answered that. The second question was like, if you don't have an answer to a question, how do you find either the answer or what thought process do you put in place to?
Yeah, and so I kind of wrap those two up in that answer, right?
Yeah.
Keeping a record of your best decisions at the time is something that I'm not saying I've always done it, but I've started to do that, and it gives me the capacity to look back and say, was that the best decision? Now knowing what I know, because it's easy to look back retrospectively and say, I should have made that decision. But at the time, with the knowledge that I had, again, that's another reason why it's important to seek out as much information from that athlete as possible, right? I'm going to seek out information from our mental skills coach, from our dietitian, from the position coach, because there might be something lost in communication that falls through cracks that you find out afterwards that would have been nice to know, right? Oh, I didn't realize that he was going through this at home, or I didn't realize that he had been struggling with this issue with his nutrition, which is why it's so important for a team to be integrative, is the communication piece about the player. A lot of times, and nutrition's kind of an interest of mine. It's just something that I picked up along the way that I found to be important. But it's always treated ad hoc. It's always treated as, oh, you need to talk about nutrition. Go see the dietitian. Go see someone who knows about nutrition, and then you'll go learn that and come back and we'll train again. But they go hand in hand, right? Nutrition drives training. Training drives what type of nutrition you should have. Your habits, both in the weight room, on the field, at home, the way you eat, they all drive each other. So it's a process that it shouldn't be, here's strength conditioning, here's nutrition, here's athletic training, here's physical therapy, they all drive each other. So I think, again, finding out as much information about a situation before you make decisions is imperative.
Yeah. Do you want to nominate someone to be interviewed?
I'll have to think about that. It has to be the right person. I want to make sure that I get the right person to you. But no, I'll get you one offline.
That is cool. Thanks. Where can people find you?
Well, Buffalo, New York, but on the internet, during this coronavirus, during the pandemic, I tried to go the exact opposite way. I got off of social media. There was a lot of information just being thrown out, and in an attempt not to be overwhelmed by it and feel like I have to read everything, and an attempt to also just personally disconnect from the world just for a minute, just for a brief moment in time. I only follow one person, and that's my wife on Twitter, and she never tweets. So my feed is nothing, right? But I am on Twitter, and I'll eventually get back on there. I'm more of a voyeur than someone who engages quite a bit. But if people reach out, I tend to respond, whether it be a direct message or an email or whatever. But Coach_Will G is my handle, and like I said, I like seeing what's going on in the world and keeping up to date about everything. But I don't engage too much in social media.
Cool. Well, thanks a lot for your time. That was awesome.
I appreciate you. That was great.
Thank you.